The first rule was never look directly at the cameras after midnight. I broke that rule on my second shift, and I've regretted it every single day since. When I accepted the job at the Sanford Research Facility, I thought it was going to be simple. Just another paycheck. A routine gig that gave me quiet nights and time to think. Maybe too much time, but that's what I thought I needed. After years in the Marines, after deployments that left me questioning everything I thought I believed about myself, I was just looking for something predictable, something safe. I should have known better. The Sanford facility wasn't like the other places I'd worked. It didn't have the rundown charm of a forgotten warehouse or the quiet desolation of an empty corporate office. No, this place was different. It had a weight to it, like the walls themselves carried memories no one dared to speak of. The first thing I noticed was the quiet. Not the usual stillness you'd expect in an empty building, but an oppressive, smothering silence. The kind that makes you strain your ears, listening for something, anything, just to prove to yourself you're not alone. On my first night, I arrived early. Military habits die hard. The supervisor, a man whose name I never learned, met me at the entrance. He was older, with deep lines etched into his face and eyes that looked like they hadn't seen a full night's sleep in years. He handed me a badge and a small, laminated sheet of paper. The badge felt heavy in my hand, the paper even heavier once I started reading it. There were rules, not the typical instructions about keeping doors locked or logging incidents. No, these rules were something else. Rule 1, don't look at the cameras after midnight. Rule 2, never open a door marked with a red X. Rule 3, if you hear footsteps but see no one, stand perfectly still. Rule 4, if the phone rings after 2 a.m., don't answer it. Rule 5, if the lights flicker twice, leave the floor immediately. At first I thought it was a joke, a weird initiation ritual for the new guy. But the supervisor's face didn't flinch. He didn't laugh, didn't smirk, didn't even offer a hint of an explanation. He just said, follow the rules. That's all you need to do. I asked him what the rules were for, what kind of place this was. He didn't answer. He just walked away, leaving me standing there with more questions than I cared to admit. The first night passed quietly, uneventfully. The cameras showed nothing but empty hallways and abandoned labs. The air felt heavy, but I chalked it up to the stale atmosphere of a building that hadn't been properly ventilated in years. But then came the second night. It was a little before midnight when it started. I was sitting in the control room, watching the monitors, the hum of old equipment filling the air. The clock on the wall ticked softly, counting down the minutes to the witching hour. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee when one of the monitors flickered. At first, I thought it was a technical glitch. These cameras weren't exactly state-of-the-art. But then I saw it. A shadow. Small at first, like a smudge on the lens, but it moved, slowly, deliberately, slipping across the edge of the frame. I leaned in, my pulse quickening. The hallway it showed was one I'd patrolled just 10 minutes earlier. It had been empty then, completely empty. But now, there was something there. The shadow was growing darker, its edges sharpening, as though it were solidifying right before my eyes. I squinted, trying to make out details, but the camera's resolution was poor. All I could see was its shape, tall, unnaturally tall, with limbs that seemed too long, too thin, and then it stopped. It was perfectly still, dead center in the hallway. At that moment, a cold dread settled in my stomach. It wasn't a person. It couldn't have been. People don't move like that. I told myself to look away. The rule was clear. Don't look at the cameras after midnight. But I couldn't. My eyes stayed glued to the screen, drawn to the thing standing motionless in the hallway. And then it turned. There was no face, no eyes, no mouth, just an empty, featureless void. But somehow I knew it was looking at me. The screen flickered again, and then it went black. For a moment, the control room was silent except for the hum of the equipment. And then, somewhere deep in the facility, I heard it. A tapping sound. Soft at first, barely audible, like someone gently drumming their fingers against a desk, but it grew louder, steadier, until it was unmistakable. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing through the empty halls. I froze. My mind raced through the rules. Rule 3. If you hear footsteps but see no one, stand perfectly still. The sound grew closer, each step measured, purposeful. I didn't dare move. My hand hovered over the control panel, my breath shallow and uneven. And then it stopped. Right outside the door to the control room. I held my breath, every muscle in my body screaming for me to do something, anything, but I couldn't. I didn't even blink. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating, until finally I heard it again. A low creak. The doorknob was turning, and that was the moment I realized I wasn't alone. I wasn't looking for adventure, not anymore. That chapter of my life had closed the day I handed back my rifle and walked away from the Corps. Being a Marine gave me discipline, purpose, something to hold on to when everything else felt like chaos. But when I came home, all I had was noise. No structure, no clear objective, just endless days of wondering what came next. So when I saw the ad for a night security guard, I didn't hesitate. The job promised quiet hours, decent pay, and a chance to get my head straight. It was everything I thought I needed, a paycheck, not ghost stories. The Sanford Research Facility was exactly what you'd expect from a place abandoned for over a decade. Tucked away in the middle of nowhere, miles of dense forest pressing in from all sides, the building loomed like a forgotten monolith. Gray, weathered concrete stretched up into a sky that always seemed overcast, even when the sun was shining elsewhere. The drive to get there was unnerving enough. Narrow roads winding through thick woods with no streetlights and no sign of life for miles. By the time the facility came into view, I was already questioning if this job was worth it. But the thought of turning around, of heading back to the nothingness I'd been living in, kept my foot on the gas. The parking lot was nearly empty when I arrived, just a handful of cars scattered across the cracked asphalt. As I stepped out of my truck, the first thing I noticed was the silence. No birds, no wind rustling through the trees, just an oppressive stillness that made the air feel heavier, like I'd crossed some invisible boundary into a place the world had forgotten. The building itself wasn't much better. Inside, the walls were lined with peeling paint and outdated posters warning of chemical spills and emergency protocols. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, their dull glow barely pushing back the shadows that clung to the corners. The facility had been shut down years ago, the details of its closure buried in bureaucratic jargon and redacted reports. Locals told stories, of course, rumors about unethical experiments, secret government projects, and the kind of work no one wanted to admit to. I didn't put much stock in any of it. People love a good conspiracy, and an abandoned lab in the woods is the perfect breeding ground for wild theories. But standing there in that cold, empty hallway, I started to wonder if maybe the rumors weren't so far off. The supervisor was waiting for me in the lobby. He didn't offer his name, just handed me a badge and a folded piece of paper. His voice was flat, emotionless as he rattled off the basics. Where the break room was, how to log incidents, what to do in case of an alarm. Standard stuff. Then he handed me the rules. It wasn't a long list, just 5 short instructions printed on a laminated card. At first, I thought it was a joke, something to mess with the new guy. But when I looked up at him, his expression didn't change. "Read these carefully," he said, "and follow them. Exactly." I unfolded the card and skimmed the list, my brow furrowing as I read. 1. Don't look at the cameras after midnight. 2. Never open doors marked with a red X. 3. If you hear footsteps but see no one, stay perfectly still. 4. If the phone rings after 2 a.m., don't answer it. 5. If the lights flicker twice, leave the floor immediately. I glanced back at him, waiting for the punchline, but he just stared at me. "What is this?" I asked, trying to keep the skepticism out of my voice. "It's what's keeping you alive," he said, his tone so matter-of-fact it sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to press him, to demand an explanation, but the way he looked at me, tired, hollow, like someone who'd seen too much, made me hesitate. Instead, I nodded, slipping the card into my pocket and telling myself it was nothing. just some weird initiation ritual. The rules were strange, sure, but I wasn't about to let some superstitious nonsense scare me off. The rest of the orientation was brief. The supervisor walked me through the control room, a cramped space lined with ancient monitors and blinking lights. The equipment looked older than me, the grainy camera feeds barely distinguishable from static. He pointed out the areas I'd be patrolling, then left without so much as a goodbye. That first night was uneventful, just long stretches of silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the building settling. The cameras showed nothing but empty corridors and darkened labs, their glass walls reflecting the flickering lights. I followed the rules, mostly out of boredom. Midnight came and went without incident, and by the time my shift ended, I was convinced the whole thing was a joke. But by the second night, I wasn't so sure. It started small, little things I could easily brush off if I tried hard enough. A faint tapping sound, like someone drumming their fingers against the wall. A red X door that seemed closer to being ajar than it had the night before. And then there were the cameras. Every time I glanced at the monitors, I felt a strange unease, like I was being watched. Not by the cameras themselves, but by something just outside their frame. Something that moved when I wasn't looking, always just out of sight. By the time the clock hit midnight, I was starting to feel the weight of those rules. Not as guidelines, not as superstitions, but as warnings. Real, tangible warnings meant to keep me safe. I wish I'd taken them more seriously. My first night at the Sanford Research Facility started quietly. Too quietly. The control room was cramped, filled with outdated equipment humming faintly under the fluorescent lights. The monitors flickered, their grainy feeds showing endless hallways and darkened labs, their reflections casting strange shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of chemicals and mildew, as if the building had trapped the essence of whatever experiments had taken place here. At first, the silence was welcome. After years of chaos and noise, the stillness felt like a relief. But as the hours dragged on, that same silence began to feel oppressive, like it was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. Around 11 p.m., I decided to do my first patrol. The hallways stretched endlessly in both directions, their linoleum floors scuffed and stained with age. The hum of the fluorescent lights was constant, a low, droning sound that seemed to echo off the walls, filling the empty space with an almost physical presence. I passed a red door on my route, its bold X painted in thick, uneven strokes. The sight of it made me pause. The supervisor hadn't explained why these doors were off limits, and part of me wanted to test the handle, just to see if it was locked. But something about the way the air felt near the door stopped me. It was subtle at first, a faint pressure, like the air had grown denser, thicker. My breathing slowed, each inhale feeling heavier, harder. The temperature seemed to drop, a coldness creeping in that felt unnatural, like it wasn't coming from the building itself, but from something inside that room. I told myself it was my imagination, and moved on, but the feeling lingered, like a weight pressing against the back of my mind. Back in the control room, I flipped through the camera feeds, each one showing more of the same. Empty halls, empty labs, the same lifeless monotony I'd seen earlier. But then, on one monitor, something caught my eye. It was subtle, just a flicker, like a shadow moving across the edge of the frame. I stared at the screen, waiting for it to reappear, but it didn't. The hallway stayed empty, the fluorescent lights casting their unchanging glow. I chalked it up to a glitch. The cameras were old, their images grainy and prone to interference. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd seen something that shouldn't have been there. As the night went on, little things began to pile up. Around midnight, I heard footsteps, faint at first, just a soft tapping sound coming from somewhere down the hall. I froze, my mind racing. Rule 3 flashed in my head. If you hear footsteps but see no one, stay perfectly still. The sound grew louder, closer, each step deliberate, measured. I gripped my flashlight tightly, my knuckles whitening as I waited. And then, nothing. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving the hallway eerily quiet once again. I wanted to tell myself it was just the building settling, but deep down, I knew better. A little after 1 a.m., my walkie-talkie crackled to life. Static buzzed through the speaker, loud and grating in the quiet room. At first, I thought it was the supervisor checking in, but there was no voice, just the static, broken only by faint, almost imperceptible whispers. I leaned closer, my pulse quickening as I tried to make out the words. It was faint, barely audible, but I could swear I heard my name. Mark. The sound sent a chill down my spine. I pulled the walkie closer, pressing the button to respond. Hello? Who's there? Silence. Then a low, guttural noise, like the sound of something breathing, heavy and slow. The static cut out, and the walkie went dead. My hand shook as I set it down. I told myself it was interference, maybe a prank from the supervisor, but I couldn't convince myself. Not anymore. On my next patrol, I passed the red door again. This time, it was slightly ajar. I froze, staring at the sliver of darkness visible through the crack. That door had been locked earlier. I was sure of it. The air around it felt heavier now, colder, the same oppressive pressure I'd felt before, but stronger. I thought about the rules, about how clear they'd been. Never open doors marked with a red X. But the longer I stood there, the more I felt like something was behind that door, something that was aware of me, watching, waiting. I forced myself to move, my footsteps echoing loudly in the empty hallway as I walked away. My heart pounded in my chest, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end with every step. When I got back to the control room, the cameras were flickering again. This time, it wasn't just one screen, it was all of them. The static was worse now, obscuring the images entirely for a moment before settling. And then I saw it. On the feed for the east hallway, a figure stood at the far end, just barely within the frame. It was tall, unnaturally so, its limbs long and thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. I stared at the screen, my heart racing as the figure began to move, slowly, deliberately, its body shifting in a way that didn't seem human. The screen flickered, and when the image returned, the figure was gone. I sat there, frozen, my mind racing as I replayed the feed in my head. Was it real, or was I losing my grip, letting the stories and the rules get to me? But deep down, I knew the answer. Something was in this facility with me, and it wasn't human. The rules were supposed to keep me safe. They were simple, direct, lines of defense against whatever was out there. But even rules have their limits. I was learning that the hard way. It was halfway through my third shift when I forgot. Just for a second, just a slip of my focus. But here, that was enough to change everything. I was patrolling the west corridor, flashlight in hand, when I heard them again, the footsteps. Faint at first, soft taps against the linoleum that echoed off the empty walls. I stopped in my tracks, heart pounding. Rule 3. If you hear footsteps but see no one, stay perfectly still. I stood there, frozen, barely breathing as the sound grew louder, closer. Each step deliberate, unhurried, until they stopped. Right behind me. The air felt colder, heavier, as if the presence was pressing against my back. I wanted to turn around to see what was there, or if there was anything at all, but my instincts screamed at me to stay still. The silence stretched on, unbearable, broken only by the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. And then I couldn't help it. I turned. There was no one there. The hallway was empty, just as it had been moments ago. But on the wall where my shadow should have been was something else. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A shadow that didn't match mine, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its limbs elongated, stretching across the wall like it didn't quite belong in this world. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. When I looked again, the shadow was gone. Back in the control room, I sat staring at the monitors, trying to calm my nerves. But the cameras offered no reassurance. One screen caught my eye, the feed for Lab 4C. It showed movement, faint but unmistakable, like something shifting just out of frame. Lab 4C was supposed to be sealed, the door locked and the room abandoned. I grabbed my flashlight and the master key, telling myself I was imagining things, that the cameras were glitching again, The hallway leading to Lab 4C felt colder than the rest of the building, the air carrying a metallic tang that stuck in my throat. When I reached the door, it was ajar, the seal broken. I pushed it open slowly, the hinges groaning like a warning. The room was empty, or so it seemed. The lab was sterile, the counters lined with dusty equipment, test tubes filled with strange cloudy liquids. But as I swept my flashlight across the walls, my breath caught. Claw marks. Deep, jagged gashes that raked across the concrete, too large and too precise to be from any animal I knew. My skin crawled as I traced them with my light, the gouges forming patterns that almost looked deliberate, like they were trying to spell something out. I didn't wait to figure it out. I backed out of the room, closing the door behind me and making a mental note to add it to my report. But deep down, I knew no report would ever explain what I'd just seen. Later that night, I found the journal. It was lying in the break room, tucked under a pile of old maintenance logs. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed with age, but the handwriting was clear, meticulous. It belonged to someone named Harris, a guard who'd worked here before me. The entries started off normal enough, complaints about the hours, the isolation, the monotony of the job. But as I flipped through, the tone shifted. The notes became frantic, disjointed, filled with cryptic warnings and desperate pleas. They watch us back. The rules aren't enough. Whatever you do, don't trust the cameras. The final entry was scrawled in shaky handwriting, barely legible. If you hear it breathing, it's already too late. I slammed the journal shut, my pulse racing. Harris was gone, that much was clear. But what had happened to him? And was I next? It was during my fourth shift that I met another guard, or so I thought. His name was Dave, and he was everything I wasn't. Easygoing, talkative, the kind of guy who didn't take anything too seriously. I ran into him in the East Wing, leaning against a vending machine with a cup of coffee in hand. "New guy, huh?" he said, flashing a grin. "Let me guess, rules freak you out?" I nodded, trying to gauge if he was serious. "Don't let him get to you," he said with a shrug. "It's just part of the gig, though." He paused, his grin fading. "You really shouldn't mess with the red doors." Later that night, Dave was gone. The last place I'd seen him was on the cameras, heading toward one of the red doors. He'd laughed it off, said he wanted to see what all the fuss was about. I tried to stop him, but he waved me off, his confidence unshakable. The footage showed him reaching the door, his hand on the handle, and then as he opened it, the screen flickered. When the image returned, the hallway was empty. I searched for him, calling his name, but there was no trace of him. No footprints, no sound, nothing but the door, now shut tight, the red X, staring back at me like a warning I hadn't taken seriously enough. Back in the control room, I rewound the footage, watching it over and over, hoping for some clue, some explanation. But every time, it ended the same way, with Dave vanishing mid-frame. And then on the next loop, I noticed something I hadn't before. In the split second before the screen flickered, there was a shadow. Tall, impossibly thin, its limbs stretching toward Dave like it was reaching for him. I turned off the monitor, my hands shaking. Whatever was in this building, it wasn't done with me yet. The clock struck midnight, and with it came the moment that would change everything. I had spent 3 nights clinging to the rules, letting them dictate my every move. But that night, I broke the first rule. It started innocently, or at least I thought it did. I was in the control room, flipping through the camera feeds, trying to distract myself from the oppressive silence. My eyes moved from screen to screen, the same empty hallways, the same flickering lights, until they didn't. On one monitor, the east hallway, I saw something that made my stomach drop. It was me. Standing there in the center of the frame was someone or something that looked exactly like me. Same uniform, same posture, even the same weary expression on its face. But I wasn't in that hallway. I was in the control room. The image on the screen sent a cold wave of fear crashing over me. My doppelganger stood motionless for a moment, staring straight at the camera, and then it moved. I watched, frozen in place, as it began walking down the hallway, heading toward the control room. Each step deliberate, its movements unnervingly precise, like it was mimicking me rather than moving naturally. I scrambled to lock the control room door, my hands trembling as I twisted the bolt into place. The footsteps grew louder, echoing through the hall outside, and then they stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear. A soft tap sounded against the door, followed by a slow, deliberate knock. "Mark." The voice was mine, distorted, twisted into something almost unrecognizable. "Mark, let me in." I backed away from the door, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The voice came again, softer this time, almost pleading. "You don't need to be afraid. I just want to talk." The door handle rattled, and I bolted. I ran down the adjacent hallway, my footsteps echoing like gunshots in the empty facility. My heart raced as I ducked into a storage room, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it with trembling fingers. For a moment there was silence, and then the voices started. At first it was just one, a low, guttural whisper calling my name. But soon it was joined by others. Dozens of voices, overlapping, growing louder and louder until they filled the room. The walls began to warp, bending inward as if something massive and unseen was pressing against them. The fluorescent light overhead flickered erratically, casting shadows that didn't belong to anything in the room. I stumbled back, my foot catching on something metal. When I looked down, I saw a hatch, its edges barely visible beneath a pile of dusty boxes. Without thinking, I pulled it open and climbed down into the darkness. The hidden room was unlike anything I had seen before. The air was stale, thick with the smell of chemicals and decay. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing rows of shelves lined with vials, each labeled in precise handwriting. Memory transference, subject 003. Fear manifestation, subject 007. Prototype Mark. My breath caught as I read the labels. One vial had my name on it. On a nearby table I found photographs, dozens of them. Each one showed someone who looked like me, dressed in various uniforms, a firefighter, a doctor, a soldier. They were all me, but not me. Next to the photos was a logbook. Its pages were filled with dense, technical writing, but one passage stood out. Project Parallax, utilizing fear as a catalyst for entity creation. Subjects exhibit signs of dissociation upon exposure. Testing indicates that certain manifestations retain autonomy post-creation. As I read, the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This facility hadn't just been experimenting with fear. It had been creating things from it, manifestations of terror given form and substance, and some of them had escaped. A loud crash echoed above me, followed by the sound of footsteps descending the hatch. I shoved the logbook into my pocket and darted deeper into the room, my flashlight sweeping across the walls until it landed on a metal door. It was marked with a red X. I hesitated for only a second before pushing it open. The room beyond was filled with containment pods, each one shattered, their glass edges jagged and stained. The pods were empty, but the walls were covered in scratches and strange symbols etched deep into the concrete. In the center of the room stood a single intact pod. Unlike the others, this one wasn't empty. Inside was a figure, its shape obscured by frost-covered glass. I approached cautiously, wiping away the frost to reveal what was inside. It was me. My own face stared back at me, eyes closed, lips slightly parted as if in sleep. My heart pounded as I stepped back, the implications racing through my mind. Before I could process what I was seeing, the pod hissed, its seal breaking. The figure inside opened its eyes, and then it smiled. The facility erupted into chaos as I fled. The walls seemed to close in, the fluorescent lights flickering wildly. I could hear footsteps, hundreds of them, echoing all around me, but I didn't stop to look. As I reached the exit, I turned back one last time. The cameras in the control room all showed the same image. Me, standing in every hallway, staring into every camera, watching. I burst through the door into the night, the cold air stinging my lungs as I ran into the woods. The facility loomed behind me, its dark silhouette against the moonlit sky. But even as I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was following me, something that knew me better than I knew myself. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they would give out. The forest was endless, its twisted trees and jagged undergrowth tearing at me as I stumbled forward. Every shadow felt alive, every sound behind me a threat I couldn't face. But eventually I stopped. Not because I wanted to, because I had to. My body refused to go any farther. When I looked up, my heart sank. The facility stood before me, its towering structure somehow more oppressive from this angle. The same cracked windows, the same looming silhouette against the pale moonlight. It was impossible. I'd been running away from it. Yet here it was, waiting for me. I tried to retrace my steps, to understand how I had ended up back here, but my memories felt wrong, fragmented, like pieces of someone else's life shoved into my head. Flashes of rooms I'd never been in, of people I'd never met, faces that looked like mine but weren't. And through it all, the unshakable feeling that I wasn't alone. I turned to look behind me, expecting to see the twisted shadows of the forest. But what I saw made my blood run cold. A figure stood in the distance, just beyond the tree line. It was too far to make out details, but its stance was unmistakable, upright, still, watching. I blinked, and it was closer. I stumbled back, my hands clutching at the rough bark of a tree for support. When I looked again, the figure was gone, but the feeling lingered, pressing down on me like an invisible weight. I don't remember much after that. When I woke up, it was daylight. The sun filtered through the trees, its warmth a sharp contrast to the icy terror I'd felt hours before. My body ached, my clothes were torn, and my flashlight was gone. I forced myself to stand, wincing with every step as I made my way out of the forest. The world felt different now, quieter somehow, like the facility had swallowed up all the sound and left only silence in its wake. By the time I reached my car, I wasn't thinking about the rules anymore. I wasn't thinking about the cameras or the doors or even the figure I'd seen in the woods. I was thinking about how quickly I could leave, how far I could get before night fell again. I quit the next day. Didn't even go back to collect my paycheck. I didn't care. But quitting didn't mean leaving it behind. Every night since, I've dreamed of that place. I dream of the hallways, of the red-marked doors, of the cameras that never stop watching. But the worst part is the dreams aren't just dreams anymore. Every time I close my eyes, I see it. I see me, standing in those hallways, staring into those cameras, watching, waiting, smiling, and sometimes I think I see it when I'm awake too. Just for a second, in the reflection of a window or the edge of a shadow, I tell myself it's my imagination, that I got out, that I'm safe now. But deep down, I know the truth. I didn't escape, not really. That's the story, my story, or at least what I can remember of it. Now, I have to ask you, what do you think? What was really happening in that facility? Were those rules meant to protect me, or were they meant to trap me, to keep whatever was inside from getting out? And that thing that looked like me, what do you think it wanted? Would you have stayed after the first night, followed the rules, or maybe broken them, just to see what was behind the mystery? Let me know what you think in the comments below. I want to hear your theories, because, honestly, I still don't have all the answers myself. If you enjoyed this story, or if it made you question what might be lurking just outside your own perception, be sure to give this video a thumbs up. It helps more than you know. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you won't miss the next story. I have plenty more like this. True, terrifying, and unexplainable. For now, stay safe out there. And if you ever find yourself in a place with strange rules, remember this: they're there for a reason.